Okay, so welcome back to the Philosopher's Oracle. So today's video is not going to be on pure philosophy, but it's going to be on what I call men of action. Some of my philosophical and personal heroes whom I believe who have enriched my life in a philosophical and practical way. And I believe discussing about them in a brief manner, or at least noting them down, might help us and might help you enrich your own worldview, because not all of them are traditional philosophers, and not all of them are are like totally not philosophers. So basically they are people somewhere in between, great men who have great insight, great wisdom, but who also have made great changes. So such people Nietzsche would call higher men, or examples of Ubermenches, and I would like to discuss about them briefly. So, first comes the Japanese warrior and philosopher, writer, and artist Miyamoto Musashi. He was born in the village of Miyamoto, and he started, and he was actually trained by his father at a young age. But later on, he would become a Roni, traveling, challenging people to duels, later perfecting himself in sword fighting. He would go on to be one of the world's greatest sword fighters, to win 32 duels to death. He also developed a technique of fighting with two swords, and even now, even today, is revered as one of Japan's greatest sword fighters and samurais. Close towards the end of his life, he began to dedicate his life he continued sword fighting, obviously, but he also dedicated his life towards learning calligraphy, art, and soon he wrote two books, Gori no Sho, the Book of Five Rings, and the Dokudo. Both of them are philosophical books, but also they're books of strategy. Musashi was not just a philosopher who just sat and write like someone like Kant or Hume, but he was a man of action. He practiced what he preached. He struggled, he suffered. He was both a warrior and a philosopher. He used philosophy in fighting and fighting in philosophy. Musashi said that the pen and the sword are the same thing. That one must be brilliant enough to be able to use both, as both the pen and the sword are very powerful. And Musashi changed my life, because after studying him, I realized that there's just more beyond just reading philosophy and just reading and sitting and understanding, that you have to actually act on it. You have to persevere, and you have to be both a warrior and a philosopher. You have to tread the path of a samurai. Next, this is my second favorite hero, Napoleon Bonaparte. Okay, there was a famous quote of his which I would like to explain. Okay, in the shade of olive trees, they said Italy cannot be conquered. In the land of kings and pharaohs, they said Egypt cannot be humbled. In the realm of snow and trees, they said Russia cannot be tamed. Now they say nothing. They fear me like a dealer in thunder and death. But I say, I am Napoleon. I am emperor. This quote resonates with Napoleon's spirit. Nietzsche himself called him an example of an Ubermensch. Hegel, the philosopher, called him the spirit on the horseback. Many philosophers and thinkers after his death used him as examples, either in affirmation or against. The Romantics were against him. People like Nietzsche and Hegel supported him. He was a hero for both conquerors and philosophers. But Napoleon is not just a man, like he's not just a warrior or a conqueror, but he's also a man of great insight. He's a genius. He's a revolutionary. The way wars were fought before him, he changed it. He broke away from convention. He became a genius. He appreciated art. He knew culture. And he had great insights. People do not consider him as a philosopher, but I do. Because the way he lived his life, the way he thought and acted, it is a beautiful example of a higher man, of a philosopher with action, with a philosopher who doesn't just sit and contemplates, but who actually does makes a change in the world. Napoleon is what Nietzsche would call an example of an Ubermensch, a man constantly striving, unendingly. And Napoleon, if you look at it again and again, is not just a conqueror, but to some extent, he's kind of administrator also. He contributed He created the Napoleonic Code and spread the ideas of the French Revolution. Beyond this, he has lived in the popular imagination of philosophers I just mentioned, and he continues to live in it even to this day. So, I would like to make one more point. The first three people I mentioned in this video are my personal heroes, and I believe they're also great examples of men of action and men of thought. Like Musashi, Napoleon wielded both the pen and his sword. We know how he wielded his sword because we know about his tactics of using speed, encirclement, the corps system, all of that. But how he used his pen, we do not know. But what we do know is that he was a highly educated man, and that without having great insight, he couldn't have reached to such height. Only a man with great insight, with strong skill, with a mentality, can reach up to this height. And even to his death, he remained revered and feared, and he remained revered and feared as one of the greatest men in history. Ah, this is my most favorite. Unlike the pure warrior that was Musashi, or unlike the full conqueror that was Napoleon, Frederick the Great was a conqueror, a bureaucrat, a warrior, and a philosopher. And I can say he was a philosopher. He loved music and art. At a very young age, he learned French, studied philosophy, learned how to play the flute and drama. And obviously, this passion for philosophy, that drive that Frederick had, it was from a young age. He would later go on to be a misanthrope. And he would also invite great thinkers, scientists, and writers such as Voltaire to his court, and he would be a personal friend of them. Beyond which, Frederick himself wrote a philosophical book known as the Anti Machiavelli, where he believed that rulers are men, like unlike Machiavelli, who claimed that it's okay that the ends justify the means and it's okay to be cruel and deceitful. Frederick argued against it. He used strong philosophical arguments. He used his wise wisdom to talk with the greatest intellectuals of his time. Someone like Christian Wolff or Voltaire would invite him into his court with open arms. And he was also tutored by one of the greatest military minds of his era. He himself would go on to become a great military genius. As in this, I do not know, it's the in the 7 Years' War, he would emerge victorious. He would go on to expand Prussia, but not just expand, but he would go on. Only, I believe, Frederick didn't really expand Prussia. He's not a great conqueror. He's a great military genius. He only conquered, I think, Saxony or not Saxony. I think he conquered Silesia, and besides Silesia, he remained to defend the rest of, Prussia from disaster. He would go on to become one of Germany and Prussia's greatest kings. And after his death, Napoleon himself would go to his grave and would say, "Gentlemen, remove your hats. If this man were alive, we wouldn't be." And we know from his battles, especially from the accounts of someone like Clausewitz, about Frederick's military genius. So, Frederick is another example of a man whose actions, through his pen and through his sword, his geniusness showed both in battle and in the might of his words. He was both a philosopher and a warrior, a man of action, a man who actually made a change in his world, who followed the path that he preached. Finally, the more modern man of action, I believe, is Ernest Junger. Ernest Junger was a World War I and II soldier in Germany. He was awarded the Iron Cross, the highest honor at that time. And he would go on to be one of the greatest literary geniuses of his time. He would also be, he's considered as a philosopher, soldier, warrior, and to some extent a kind of a scientist also. Books like M.S. Will, The Marble Cliffs, Storm and Steel, these works would go on to outlive him, and his reputation would precede him. He would go on. I would say he's a philosopher and a warrior because it takes a lot of courage to become a soldier to fight in a dreadful war like in World War I and II. He actually fought in the front lines. He saw the torments and tortures, and we know this from his book Storm and Steel, where he describes what it was. He goes on to explain how soldiers have been reduced to workers and how there is no more glory in fighting a war like it used to be. But despite all of that, he is a man of action because throughout his life, he lived the way he preached. He continued to live according to his principles and his ideas. as a man who not only sat under the shade of the trees and saw change, but a man who was speaking about change and who actively participated in change itself. So we must take inspiration because I believe this Napoleon, Frederick, and Musashi are very old. I feel like they're not very applicable to the modern times. But someone like Junger is a much more closer example of a man of action in the modern era, and we must look at people like him and take inspiration for not just being a silent spectator, but an active participator, both using the pen and the sword. And finally, this person also revolutionized the way I thought. Yukio Mishima. He was nominated for Nobel Prize 5 times. He was mentored by one of Japan's Nobel Prize winners. He in his youth, like when he was a kid, like about our age. I mean, if anyone was a kid or like at a young age watching this video, he was about your age when what do you say, World War II started out. He saw the destruction, he saw the chaos. He wanted to die an honorable death in war. He believed in the way of the samurais. He was against some form of modernization and he believed in the traditional samurai way. But despite that, Mishima was both an artist, a philosopher, a writer, and a warrior. He would go on to be a martial artist. He would be an actor. Again, I told you about the Nobel Prize thing, and that was his artistic genius. That see, people think writing is also kind of an art, and Mishima was a genius writer, and the books he wrote were absolutely sublime, but not as sublime as his essay Sun and Steel, which act, which goes on to explain the aesthetics of the flesh and blood. He explains about how exercising, how training, how physically training your body is kind of like an aesthetic practice. Just like how the Greek statues have beautiful cuts, slender abs, and like all of those muscles. He's saying the same way when we exercise, we also tend to do an art. We tend to partake in an artistic process. Like it's like we're sculpting our own body to have a beautiful aesthetic taste. So Mishima also took part in an active political rivalry against the government. So we must know Mishima is another example of a man of action, a higher man, a man who not only just sat on the peripheries up on the towers, locked himself and just saw change and wrote about change, but who was the change, who lived through the change, saw the change, who wrote about the change, and participated in it. We must know that all of these men have one theme in common, that they don't just sit back and they don't just write or they don't just talk, but they actively participate. Napoleon through his conquest, Frederick through his administrative genius and his, conquest, not, I wouldn't say conquest, but defense and to some level expansion of Prussia. Mishima through, the active rebellion against the government and what do you say, through kendo, the Japanese art of sword fighting, and Mishima through his eternal, endless, tireless, what do you say, pursuit of perfecting his art as a sword fighter. So we must learn one thing from all of these great men, that they are higher men, that these men are not only the people who wrote about change but lived through that change. And I can only give you a brief description of these people because I wanted, to give you guys an insight. But in future videos, I will do an in-depth analysis of most of these people. Thank you. And if you like this channel, please like and subscribe and join. Thanks.